We're going to discuss today the benefits for schools and other education institutes who embrace private sector involvement and also look at some of the risks that are involved. How do you convince the private sector to get involved in education?
The first thing that we highlight is the size of the education industry. It's the third largest industry in the world, though people don't think of it as an industry, right? But behind energy and healthcare, education comes third. It's between a $4.6 trillion a year or a $5.4 trillion a year sector, depending on who you're asking. And so if there's a market size and there's innovation, it's possible to create returns for investors. The second thing we have to explain is that now is a very interesting time where you can find innovative entrepreneurs and corporations that are creating value in the long term by discovering new service delivery models.
In Latin America, your question about how the private sector gets involved, I think we have been seeing the last 15 years increasing interest from the private sector to improve quality of education. The Latin America, as an average, is spending around 5% of its GDP on education. It's almost like the average OECD country. So it's a lot of money from the public sector, but quality has not been improving. So I think the private sector realized that needed to get involved. At the end of the day, companies are the ones hiring this human capital and this talent to improve or expand their companies, and they were realizing that the education sector were not bringing the right talent.
It seems like there's a lot of ed tech companies cropping up everywhere. Has that made it, I guess, more competitive and harder to convince them to invest?
No. So there has been a surge of early stage entrepreneurship on record, let's put it that way, where in 2007, when I started a company in education, there were only about 50 companies that had been backed by venture capital anywhere. Fast forward to 2015, that number is approaching 1,000 different companies. What we say is that there are so many innovative, bold entrepreneurs that are extremely talented, not only at knowing where the problems are in education, but also at starting and scaling companies and building great business models. And we have so many different opportunities to vet that we're going to be able to select the most competitive companies and the best operating teams. And because of that, the probability that we're able to find gems goes up. When somebody invests with us, they invest for 10 years. And given that they don't have access to that cash and they can't do anything else with it, generally they're happy if we can provide something that's called a 20% or more IRR, internal return on investment. And so that's kind of like saying that over that 10-year period, it would be the same as putting money in the stock market and making 20% per year on that money. In general, investors that are investing in education, not only do they want to see that internal rate of return, but they also want to see important work being done. And in a way, that's an act of storytelling. That's an act of telling inspiring stories like Cuepa and the work that they're doing and the impact that they're having. Some funds choose to measure that and choose to sell that impact first. We choose to measure that, but we don't sell the impact first. We actually sell that this is a viable asset class and that this is a viable sector to put money and make great returns.
Yeah, that point, I think, is an interesting point in the relationship between investors and entrepreneurs. Because when you are an entrepreneur, you are going to sell your project, your company to an investor like Learn Capital. They find that in education it's much harder to sell than in energy or consumer goods or technology in general. First, because at least in Latin America, investors are not used to invest in education. It's a new sector. People are not, it's huge, as Michael was saying, but they're not familiar with other successful cases. And also there is a lot of discussion that we might agree on now, the social impact, which sometimes I feel is much more an excuse to talk about these issues that are real impact. No? Because what does social impact mean? It's amount of students, is the amount that they are learning, is the jobs they find, is the income they get. So I think that sometimes we need to really go back to economic and financial impact. That's sometimes a very, we have 17,000 students in Cuepa. If I can show that they get 10% increase in income after they leave my schools. I'm having a financial impact because I'm growing as a company, I want to get more students, and I'm having a social impact. So I think that we entrepreneurs need to learn how to align social impact with financial impact and convince investors that it's very similar, because at the end of the day, you're a commercial success if you are delivering a good product. A good product means good education, better jobs, good education, better income, better skills. No? So that combination sometimes we entrepreneurs are not doing it correctly. We say, well, no, we are in education, you should help me. I say, why? No, because we are helping human beings. Well, yeah, but there are so many people helping human beings in so many industries. Why will I help you and not someone doing energy or health, no, or anything else?
Financial investors, venture capital investors, we are willing to start putting a lot of capital into something when the spreadsheets work, frankly, right? And investors are attracted to businesses where when they look at the underlying numbers, the spreadsheets work and the numbers get bigger, right? And I think historically in education, people didn't even have to do spreadsheets, right? Like they didn't have to make sure the numbers worked. And in part, it was because of the state subsidies and the nonprofit operators in the space.
So that discipline that funds bring to the table saying, if you don't scale up, if you are not sustainable, I will not give you more money. It's good for us. We hate it. We don't like it when they say it, and we don't like it when they have that arrogant way of saying, no, bring me money or you're out of my desk. But it's a discipline, you know, if you rationalize it, very important for us because it focuses on, if I don't bring revenue to my company, I cannot impact more people.
Is there ever a danger that governments could become too reliant on this sort of thing and kind of use it to justify further underfunding of the sector?
Yes, and I would say that sometimes when I get into less fun debates with people from the public sector, they look at us as dangerous because they think if private capital starts working in the education sector, that's inherently threatening to what the public sector is doing in education. I don't think that that's true. I don't think that that history is that dialectic, right? I think that there are ways that you can forge public-private partnerships. There are ways that regulators can create guidelines that everyone has to and wants to operate within, particularly around transparency and accountability.
And if you look at countries that are doing well in PISA, there are many things that they are doing well, but the one that you see, I think, in all of them is that much of the society is aligned under the vision that human capital is key or education is key. So government alone or private sector alone will not fix this education or skills gap that we see everywhere. In countries like Chile or like Colombia, where the government set a framework that the private sector can participate, are doing better than other countries. So I think that regulation and that framework is key.
I think that there are policymakers, particularly in the United States, but also everywhere, that think that the state doesn't work in certain, frankly, they think the state doesn't work and they want to defund the state. And even though I'm in the private sector and I do venture capital and I believe in entrepreneurs, I don't believe in that, right? I don't vote for that. And I get mad every time a university system or public school system ends up with less funding and is expected to do more with less, because that's not an equation that works. Go do more with less, right? But that being said, that I think that the two concepts are not necessarily related. You know, a society doesn't have to say, we only believe in the private sector, let's defund the public sector, or we only believe in the public sector, we have to cram out the private sector and regulate them to death. That's not the way, you know, it's not a dialectic, I don't think.
You hear people raise concerns or fears about the private sector influencing the curriculum. What are some of the risks, I guess, for education institutions that do leverage private capital?
That's an easy one for you, Michael.
So I think that large corporations that get very self-interested and involved in political interest groups and political campaign donations should not be influencing the content that's learned in schools, right? I think that we certainly don't fund those companies. We fund very underfunded entrepreneurs that have something very unique to add to education in some niche way. They're often not even touching the content, for instance.
But I may argue that it's actually the opposite. I think we should get more influence in this, at least in higher education or in high school, more influence from the labor market in the curriculum. Because you see, at least in Latin America, you see the opposite. This is skills gap of high school is teaching this and the labor market is demanding exactly the opposite. So I will want companies to be more involved, at least in a dialogue with the government.
Companies should be aligning curriculum to
exactly, not
skills that are needed in the market.
Okay,
sorry.
Yeah. No, but you are right what you said. But
I think the concern is you don't want oil companies writing the chapters on climate change, right?
No, but I would want oil companies to write the chapters about energy engineering. How can you produce talents that will go work to 80% of these corporations if those two sectors don't talk to each other? No, so why don't you see more teachers being interns in some companies or some employees from companies teaching in high schools? I think that will really help.
What are some of those skills that the future workforce needs and that private companies obviously have great insight into?
People will change jobs 13, 15 times in their careers. Young people that start to work in 2016. No? How can you predict what will they need? What they need is many more soft skills. They need to learn how to adapt. They need to be their startups of themselves. They need to have empathy. They need to have intellectual curiosity to be able to learn more things and move to the next job. All things that schools and really families are not doing.
Well, no, so I agree. I mean, I think the fundamental skill for the future is actually the ability to identify valuable skills, rapidly learn and acquire them, and be able to create value, right? Whether that's within a company or as being self-employed or as an entrepreneur, right? And that is not currently being taught in American public education. I would argue that the opposite is being taught. The idea of teaching kind of how do you identify valuable skills, rapidly develop them, and then create value in the world is one that we have several entrepreneurs that are saying that they want to teach to the world and have an interesting way of teaching it. But the public school system has not shown that they're capable of adapting that quickly. And that's when kind of getting these emergent ideas and emergent models is extremely important. And that's why early stage investing in entrepreneurs and founders plays such an important role in innovation, because ideas are not top down, ideas are bottom up.
Just to conclude, what are three things that investors and entrepreneurs would like to see governments do to sort of help this trend thrive in the future?
We would like clearer frameworks, clear regulations. You need regulation, as we were agreeing with Michael, but focus on outcomes and assessments, not focus on anything else.
And transparency.
Transparency, exactly. So if you develop a good product, you might want to go and sell it to the government. So transparency and clear process, I think the procurement process are important. I think that the government should be open to innovation and then try to reduce that ideologically debate where the private sector is always there for the profit. It's about no quality. It's about making a profit fast. I think that's much more an ideological debate than a factual debate. And I think sometimes that is pushed or led by politicians. And I think that's not productive for society. I think we should have a more open debate about quality of education. It doesn't matter who provides quality of education.
I agree that there need to be clearer rules of the road, and that those rules need to be focused on the goals and the outcomes, not on the models and the processes. And they should probably actually be simplified. I mean, in a way, they kind of don't exist now, but the older regulatory frameworks are extraordinarily complex. The other thing, frankly, the government has the ability to activate capital markets to serve public goods. So in the United States, they've been extremely active in promoting homeownership. And they do that through a variety of financial instruments. And one of the things that they do is they kind of guarantee mortgages. They don't even have to put that much money up. They just have to make people feel safe, right? And maybe that safety is a little bit of an illusion, but there are certain tricks of the trade where they activate capital markets for residential real estate, for the energy sector, for commercial real estate development. And they do that because they believe that private capital working in a certain direction is going to come up with a public good outcome. And they haven't done that in education at all. And I think if they just used some of those tools and applied them to the education sector, you'd see kind of an unleashing of innovation and private capital going into the market.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.